I'm just kidding, Internet. All right. My name is Daniel. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Internets, for joining us. That's Peter Brown. He's going to go over some sweet stuff. Let's do this.
Some sweet stuff. All right. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Mike Acosta from ADSR, for hosting this great event. And thank you, Alchemy, Denver. This is my first time in Denver, so if anybody has any suggestions, just yell it out at any point during the workshop of things to do between now and 11:30 tomorrow morning. Oh my God. So I've heard that's a thing, which is pretty cool. Anyway, all right, so I'm gonna get into trouble. So TR-8S. So the TR-8S is our newest drum machine that we've came out with, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard that it exists in some capacity, maybe seen it online, maybe seen a video of me or somebody else attempting to play it and kind of show off all of its complexities and strengths and really kind of unique features. And for those of you that don't know, what is a TR-8? What is a TR-8S? Who is Roland? What are we doing here? The TR-8 and the TR-8S are two drum machines that emulate all of Roland's classic sounds from our previous drum machines. Classics like the 808s, the 909s, 707, 727. How many of you guys actually have a classic Roland drum machine? Okay, which one do you have? You have the 808 and the 909. Those are that's like Poseidon and Zeus, right? That's like serious business. But for people that have not grown up with those machines, we've definitely heard it in pop culture, in music. There's songs referencing the 808 by name, albums, Kanye, yeah, whatever. It's really kind of a fantastic legacy that Roland has. And the TR-8 and the TR-8S kind of encapsulate that. They combine all of those sounds into a drum machine that you're able to use just like the original, but you have a lot of modern features stacked on top of it. So an original 808 user might know that there are some limitations. You couldn't tune certain drums, even like the kick drum, you couldn't tune it up and down, which is what people want to do with 808s anyway. That's like the first thing that they reach for. It's like, okay, how do I tune this thing? You couldn't do that. And a lot of the times, an 808 fresh out of the box sounded pretty good, but it didn't sound like album oriented. Like that's when people started to mod it. They started to adjust some capacitor in the internal, there's mods that you could do to these drum machines that make it sound a little bit more album ready. And the TR-8 and the TR-8S kind of encapsulate that control, and they put it in a package at a convenient price. Oh my God, can't believe I just said that. I've been working for too long. Anyway, so the TR-8S, just to start off, has all of those classics, and I can just play basic stuff, which you would recognize the drum sounds from. Like this, very clearly is the 808. And some of the benefits from using something like this is I can start to shape the drum sounds a little bit deeper than I can with a sample of an 808. So let's take the hi-hats, for example. Can stretch that decay out. I can change the tuning, make it sound trashier or a little bit more dull or a little bit more crispy. Same thing with the clap. Clap, I can kind of make it sound dull, make it sound a little bit more bright, change the decay, and it all reacts at a very kind of organic manner. And that's because the thing that actually shapes the sound inside this box is circuit modeling. These are technically digital, but they offer such a large amount of control over the original drum sounds that you can't really achieve with samples. If somebody gives you a sample of an 808 kick drum, it's going to sound like that. You can pitch it up and down, you can EQ it, but it's not going to change the character. If somebody gives you a 909 kick drum sound, for example, it's kind of locked into that. So, segue into, some 909 sounds. I can quickly kind of go into that drum kit and then play back the same pattern just with a 909. Let's take that kick drum, for example. So if I solo the kick, I have the ability to tune the kick, but it's not actually tuning it like a sample up and down. It's actually shaping the envelope. It's shaping the character of the drum sound. So I'll lower that gradually. Here it kind of flattens out a little bit. I can raise it. Gives more of a chest bump. Like this is super cool to have that control on a box and not need to like touch a computer or not need to really put any effort into it. This is like a really kind of handy thing. I can even change the smack of it, the attack, make it sound super punchy, or flatten it out but have that kind of like transient in there. A lot of really deep sound editing possibilities kind of live within the TR-8S. And I think it's really cool because it gives you a lot more types of, a lot more control over it than you can with samples. That's probably one of the strongest features about something like this. So, and don't be afraid to raise a hand or ask a question or something that's a little bit more specific. I'd be happy to get into it too. My flow's not gonna get wrecked or anything. So, the shaping of drum sounds is really powerful with something like the TR-8. And the TR-8S, we've added a bunch of user feedback that we've gotten over the past 4 years since we released the TR-8 about like 4 years ago. We came out with it, people liked it, but they had a lot of suggestions. They're like, oh man, it sounds really great, but it wants more I want more analog outputs. I want individual outputs to route to my mixer or to like guitar pedals and things. Or, you know, I really wish I could load in my own samples. You know, that I like Roland sounds, but I don't like them that much. Like I want to like load in, you know, some of my own types of things that I made. Or man, I wish that there was more pattern storage, which, as you can guess, has all been addressed in the TR-8S, our newest drum machine. And I think it's really cool because they took the best feedback. They took the feedback for imported samples. They took the feedback for upgraded programming, doing things like sub-steps, last steps, which I'll kind of show off in a little bit, more effects, individual track effects such as distortion and compression. You can produce with it a lot more and get more kind of fuller sounding productions. And it just takes something from like the Roland drum world and like brings it into many more genres that you can use it for. So it really kind of took those great ideas and put it into one box. So that being said, I'm going to go into a little bit more of like, what does a hybrid Roland drum kit sound like? What does that mean? You know, you have the 808s, 909s, 707 sounds, which people have kind of like gotten accustomed to and grown with. But when you start to kind of morph them with imported samples, it starts to sound pretty cool. Even like some of the 808s and 909s that I can use on here, I can put effects on them like distortion, filters, things like that on an individual track basis to get something that sounds really kind of unique and interesting. Like with these toms right here, I have it kind of running through distortions. And then I also have the kind of like a 909 kick drum, but there's like some 808 hi-hats happening. I can kind of create hybrid kits, which is really cool. And then using the interface, which I'm sure you guys, do we have the overhead of the, yeah. So with the interface of the TR-8S, you have tuning, you have decay, and you have now what's new in the TR-8S, a control knob. A row of control, assignable things that you could use to control anything in that instrument's track, which I think is really cool. Things like filters, things like coarse tuning for samples, things like sample rate playback, the ability to reverse samples, things like that. That's all kind of available in there for you, which I think is really great. So there's a lot of patterns that when you buy this thing and when you start to use it, some of the built-in content showcases that, which I think is really handy. You know, you have things like the row of control knobs controlling filter cutoffs of different samples, which I think is a lot of fun to use, especially for performance-oriented things. So with this particular example here, check this out. So I have two channels on here that are two different samples that I have with high-pass filter on one sample and a low-pass filter on the other sample, which I can kind of use independently. That's just with two. So if I bring in something else, I can also make use of that as well. But you couldn't do this on the TR-8. You couldn't do this on just like a drum machine. So the fact that you can kind of like bring in your own sounds, take advantage of the new like control, the control knobs, using in different filters and effects on the different sounds makes it a lot more flexible. If I wanted to bring in some other elements. I get a really kind of much fuller sounding production than I could with the original one. The original TR-8, it sounded really good, but it was just strictly drums. That's like all that you could do with it, which is great if you want something that's like a basic drum machine and you don't want to do anything else. But with this, you can start to kind of branch out into different types of things. It comes with a bunch of built-in sounds that a bunch of us over at Roland made, things like custom snare drums, kick drums, percussion, things like that. There's weird sound effects. There's a library of power tools like jackhammers and things like that, which is pretty rad. That's kind of cool. But it's because you have a bunch of effects in there. You have a bunch of things that you can actually play around with and take a sample that might sound kind of like dry when you import it. It has a lot of sound shaping tools there to kind of mess around with it. So maybe I can actually showcase a little bit of what that sounds like. So with this, so I want to change this to this cool little guitar lick. So I just imported like a guitar loop there. Which I think sounds like really rad when you tune it down. But I have a decay right here too. So you kind of see where I'm going with that. So if I want to sequence that, which is pretty cool, I mean, I think it's pretty cool. So if I want to sequence that, I can go here to the sequencer, which most of you that are familiar with drum machines know how to kind of use the step sequencer. I can go in and start to kind of program that pattern. I can hit start, and then I can go in and start to sequence that sample that I imported. Which is cool. I can kind of make it more of like a stab. I can go into the sample itself and do things like stereo spread, which is really cool and maybe impossible to hear here, but it's one of the interesting things that it has. If you import a sample and if you're using audio and not the circuit modeled sounds, you have a completely dedicated effect list that you can have. Things like bit reduction to get more of like kind of like a wet or more lo-fi, because people often say that the TR-8S sounds really great, but it's almost like the cleanest of all the drum machines that are out right now. It sounds almost too clean, like too hi-fi. So you can use things like bit reduction and some of those lo-fi effects to kind of dirty it up a little bit. Things like built-in filters as well, I can start to use. I could start to bring in some of the send effects. And then if I want to build a beat around that, it's super easy. And then I can already just kind of form an idea around that. I'm basically just using one measure of music, but I'm implementing all these samples and effects on a pattern where originally I could have just drums. Now I can start to incorporate different types of sound elements into the pattern that I'm creating. So it's a lot of fun to use. It's super easy. I did that in like 2 seconds. If I wasn't talking, it would be like very, very easy and fluid. So questions so far on anything? I don't want to go too fast for anybody, but if anybody has any questions at all, just shoot up a hand. Yes, sir.
So, just like the SP404,
So the question is, SP404 has 16-bit sampling. This, you can import up to 32-bit samples, 24, 16. You can even import 8-bit samples, which is super rad. And for all my modular people, all the outputs are DC coupled. So if you import just like CV stuff, I haven't tried it. I'm not liable, but since they're DC coupled, you could probably use a lot of this in more of a modular context, like start to like spit out weird control signals and stuff like that for your modular rig. But as far as sample content goes, it's all wave. Oh, you can do waves from 32 bits to 8 bits, and then AIFs, I think, is like 16-bit and 24-bit. The specs are in the manual, but I know it's pretty agnostic to the sample types that you're putting into it. I mean, it just has to be AIF or wave. So that's really nice. You don't have to convert anything. If you have like a whole library of samples that are 32 bits, if you have the hard drive space for that, good for you. You can use that. But it's really nice. So some of the other sound aspects to this are the built-in send effects, I think, sound really cool. They have upgraded reverbs, delay modes, master effects, things like flanging, phasing, a lot of, there's an interesting sideband filter kind of ported from the System 8. System 8 owners, anybody? Anybody has a System 8? You should check that synth out. It's awesome. It's really good. Or vSynth GT. Any vSynth owners? Hey, I have an XT myself. So the sideband filters from that line of synthesizers, they ported into here to get some really experimental tones. So when you start to take advantage of some of those effects, you start to kind of create things that are a little bit more interactive and a little bit more kind of goes beyond just like house music or techno or hip hop. So in this pattern, I have kind of like a little bit of samples, a little bit of send effects, and I'm also making use of something that I'll go into in just a moment, the automation that you can use with this. You can now automate any of the controls on this thing. You can start to tune melodies. You can make gestural kind of hi-hat animations, things like that. So let's take a listen to this and see if we can kind of pick up what's happening. So here there's like samples that are being tuned up and down. That's also being implemented. We have the delay being automated too. Which I think sounds really cool and glitchy. Like it really just sounds, there's a lot of depth. There's a lot of really cool depth to some of the effects that are on here. And I think it sounds really kind of high fidelity and just really kind of, I don't want to say like track ready. That sounds a little bit more marketing lingo, but it just sounds like really kind of full and deep. So one of the cool things that I like to mess around with as well is the tape echo that's on here. And I think the tape echo sounds absolutely ridiculous. I think it sounds really cool. So if I have that sample, I can do a really cool shortcut where I hold the instrument button that's on and move the delay level knob right here. Cool. Okay, you guys can see that. Awesome. So I can do that, and then it automatically sends that to the delay. And so with this delay, I think it's our tape echo emulation that they put in here. So if I go into where I can kind of change the settings around and a little bit more of a deep level, I can hold shift and hit kit and go all the way to where I have the delay section. Oh, it looks like it's just on the regular delay. So I can go from the standard delay, I can go from the panning delay that does a ping pong effect, then I can go into where it's called tape echo, which has this like really cool diffused, very dubbed out type of vibe to it. And if I go further along, I can see that there's a section where I can kind of change the tape heads that are being used, whether they're like small, medium, or large. different combinations of the two. Go even further, I could start to EQ it. Start to do panning. Start to kind of like make more of an atmospheric effect. Start to mess around with the tape distortion over time. Anybody have a space echo in there? Okay, you've had everything. That's awesome. That's super cool. Yeah. The next workshop, I think, is at your place, I think. Sure.
So does it save all of that information for each one of those samples in that pattern bank?
Yeah, all of the...
Like 1 through 16, so you can keep all of your samples saved for each, you know what I mean?
Yes, yeah. So the question is, do samples save with the pattern bank? And they do. So when you create a drum kit, you basically create something that's called a kit. And the kit stores all of those settings of like tuning. This stores all the effects, stores pretty much everything having to do with the instruments that you're using. And when you save the pattern, it saves the kit that you're using with that. So when you recall that pattern, it's looking like, oh, this is like using, Joe Schmo's kit number 1, and it plays Joe Schmo's kit at number 1. Yeah, exactly. So you can use it to a dramatic effect. You can kind of have, like if I'm going to play like 2 patterns that have totally different kits. And if I go to something that's different, it'll change all of the samples that are associated with that. And then it'll go into something that sounds... So with that, with those patterns, actually, they're using some of the same samples, but yeah, they basically changed the entire sound set that you use, which I think is pretty nifty and convenient. And also, there's options that you can kind of, have a global tempo set for everything, so it doesn't mix up, your flow when you're performing. So it makes it really easy to kind of have that. So the sound that I've kind of got into a little bit of the sound character of the TR-8S. There's a lot of effects that you can choose from, and there's a lot of depth to the way that you can shape sounds. Let's get a little bit more into some of the programming upgrades, because I think they really did an awesome job in terms of what they added to it. In the old TR-8, you can have basically a pattern and then 2 variations, basically like an A section and a B section. Now you have, for every pattern, you have 8 variations that you can chain together sequentially in any order. You can copy everything in real time. I don't need to stop the sequence to copy anything, which was like kind of huge. They have now, in addition to 16 patterns, you have 8 banks of 16 times 8 variations. So the actual measure count of music that you could write with the drum machine is in the thousands, I think. It's like maybe 1024 or something like that. It's great. You can really kind of flesh out more fuller sounding sets and drum beats and production with this, kind of taking advantage of that. So they upgraded that. They've upgraded, I mentioned the automation earlier, which I can kind of show a little bit about how easy it is to do. So with this pattern, for example, so if I want to say like automate that hi-hat decay, I can go to where it says motion, turn motion on, which it is, hit record, now it's armed, and it's going to basically pick up any knob that I start to move on here. That's like a small example, but that's awesome. That's like, you couldn't do that in the old one, and it's so easy. I can press and hold the record button to do kind of a momentary record. So I automated that claps tuning. And here's where it gets really interesting. I can have the motion turn off everything globally, which you could use to a dramatic effect. I can turn on. like that's such a simple feature, just being able to kill the automation, then bring it back. And if you're using melodic tuning automation happening at the same time, like it really gets a lot more variance to your patterns. I always felt that the TR-8, as much as I used it and as much as I really liked it, you really had to massage it in a way to make it sound not repetitive. And the fact that you can start to automate things and tune things and start to generate more song ideas with this, it makes it a little bit more like you can create longer phrases, you can listen to things more at length, and it really kind of ties an entire idea together. So with that, you can motion record anything on here. You can motion record any of the global parameters like master effect or delay times, as is in the previous pattern. You can kind of get more experimental stuff that way. It really kind of branches out beyond just like making drum sounds, and you can start to use it as like more of a synth voice, which people, we came out with this, and there's immediately a video of somebody jacking the BPM to 300 and turning this into a drone machine, like notes on every instrument on every step, which, yeah, no, I'm not gonna do it here. I tried it once, and then people just kind of looked at me weird. I'm like, I'm just gonna, I'll send you the link. Yeah, we'll do it after. Yeah, that's the private demo. Okay, so some of the other cool programming features that they've added, which you might have heard with this hi-hat pattern, not just the automation, but the what's called substeps. Substeps are a way to divide every step into double, triple, or quadruple hits, so you get more ratcheting rhythms or faster repetitions. So if I just start a hi-hat pattern. Let's start a hi-hat pattern from scratch. So I have something that's really basic. I can hold sub. There's a dedicated button for it. Hold it. On the screen, it says, "Oh, what kind of length do you want? Do you want a half, third, a fourth?" So maybe if I just do half, I can hold sub and then put some notes on the sequence, and it gives me that faster repetition. If I want something that's even faster, I could put it. It records those different types of substeps in there automatically, and I can start to kind of mess around with the velocities of those as well to get a little bit more of an intricate groove happening. So I mean, it's not just for trap music, but you can use that for anything. Like that could be applied to any kind of genre of music to get a little bit more of kind of a fast-paced rhythm, something that sounds a little bit more complex. And I think it's great. You'll notice that I keep using the 808 hi-hats, and I just think it's because they sound. That's like what I want hi-hats to sound always. And so sorry if that gets a little bit old, but that's just my style, so you're gonna have to deal with it. Anyway, so moving on, they also added in the old TR-8, you could basically set a pattern length to a pattern length of one step, if you're crazy, or anywhere between 1 and 16. Now they've taken that concept to do each instrument track has up to 16 steps of length of pattern time, meaning I can get more polyrhythm. So if I wanted to, if we're kind of like hanging out on this pattern for a while. So say I want that open hi-hat to maybe be only 12 steps long, or maybe even 11 steps long. We're gonna get weird. So I hit last, I hit open hi-hat, and I can set it to 11 steps, and already I'm starting to get some weird stuff happening, which is great. I like weird stuff. I can hit, say, high tom, maybe make that only 7 steps long. Or maybe, let's do mid tom. Start to get more kind of polyrhythm type of stuff happening. Like, have you been to a Berlin techno show? Like that's kind of that's a lot of it is like you could play a whole set with just polyrhythms, and like that is super fun just to kind of come up with really kind of polyrhythmic, interesting time signatures, and maybe just have like some really basic, like even if I just did 4 on the floor. And I'm just using one variation too. That carries over for all the variations. So if I chain together an 8-bar phrase, it'll kind of carry over that polyrhythm over the bar line for my music theory friends. So Lots of GoPro woes today. But I think that's really cool because it, again, kind of breaks it out of just the normal kind of house techno or hip hop, world, and starts to kind of get a little bit more influence from different types of like world music or mixed time signatures. You could change the scale like you could on the TR-8 with this, but now you can get a little bit more time signatures happening. So, questions so far on any of those upgraded features or anything? Cool beans. Awesome. So one of the last things that we'll kind of get into basically of the upgrades of the TR-8 is this white box. Okay, you can't see that. The white box, this white box right here, which is anybody that's owned an NPC users. Okay, nice. Wow, a lot of NPC users. Awesome. So let's take say this sample right here. And use the performance pad. The performance pad is this like really kind of cool way to basically tap in grooves, like an old 808 or the TR-8. There's a tap button on the bottom right that you could basically tap in the rhythm that you're hearing in your head without having to go into a specific type of mode or step sequence. So if you're more of a player, this is the button for you. So if I have something that I'm thinking in my head. Yes, sir. Can the performance pad be expanded with an Octopad?
Check. The answer to that is yes. So if you have an MPC, or if you have an MPD, is it an MPD? MPD 226 or something like that, you can plug it into the MIDI input of that guy, and then you can have all of your velocities and all of your tunings. So let's say you're doing instrument record mode, and you're using your MPC, but you want to sequence, or your MPD, and you're sequencing inside of the TR-8S, it'll record all of that velocity. So yes, so if you use something like an SPD SX, an SPD1, or something of that nature, it will record all of those different velocities in your different drum pads.
Yeah. Boom. Bombshell. So the velocity pad on this is velocity sensitive up to 2 levels, weak and strong hit. And that's kind of mimicking a little bit of the velocity capabilities of the TR-8 and the 909, because I don't think the 808 had velocity sensitivity. However, you can also use the step sequencer to implement any velocity between 0 and 127. And here's how you do it. So if I had my snare drum, I can hold, say, a step in time here, and then use the accent knob. And I don't know if you can see the screen. It says velocity, and I can use this to adjust anywhere between 0 and 127. And I get a lot more kind of a fine-tuned velocity. So that's awesome when it comes to like making more organic grooves, organic drum beats. In the old TR-8, you can only basically do 2 levels plus accents. Now you have a whole kind of world of dynamics to play with. Questions so far on that, on anything? Because we're going to get into some modular stuff in a hot second. Yes, sir. Heck yeah. Oh. Swing per channel? No, you have a global swing. Global swing basically will swing every instrument to the same value. There's no independent swing, unfortunately, with this. Yes? All the effects that come on there. Are you ready for this? So in terms of master effects, there's different types of low pass, low pass, and high pass, and multi-mode filters. There's also high and low end boosts. There's isolators, kind of things that kind of do more DJ style blending type of effects, which is kind of cool. There's transient shapers, envelope followers, bit crushers, drive, different types of distortion and overdrive, bit crushers, phasing, flanging, sideband filtering, noise, and all of those effects have like a deeper level of editing than just basically one control. You can like change the polarity of the phaser, or you can adjust like pre and post EQ of the distortion to get like really cool, gnarly, different types of overdrive. It's deep. Yes, to a certain extent. So with the automation, so the question for the stream was if you can do per step automation of different types of effect controls. And I'll basically say that the control knob can be mapped to any of the effect controls itself, and you can automate that knob. So if that knob is controlling like the cutoff of a filter, or maybe the resonance, you can automate that control on the sequencer. Yes, sir.
Is scatter rate limited, and if so, how?
Oh, that is a really good question. That's a totally good question, because I blanked out on the autofill feature, which is borrowed from the 808 and the TR-8. So scatter is now re-implemented as a autofill in, basically as a way to throw in a drum fill either through, maybe every 2 measures all the way up to 32 measures, or manually. And I'll demonstrate that. So say I have this cool, nifty pattern. And I want to do scatter. I can hit, there's a section right here that says autofill in. I can hold the on button of that section, and then the sequencer will show me which fill-in is selected. I can have up to 2 user programmable fills or the scatter effect. So it's become more tightly integrated into the playback. So how do you adjust the depth, you might ask? So you can hit the manual trig and then use the value knob, and you get that both loved and hated scatter effect. It was really polarizing. Much like the original's green color, the scatter knob was like, I don't know, people had a fit over it.
I really want a scooper, honestly.
Oh, the scooper is awesome. Scooper's great. They are. Those are one of those Roland products, man, that like come out for like a hot second, people get confused, so they stop making it, and then people just realize it's awesome. So you can find them though. They're out there. Search local retailers, small local synth shops. They'll have them. But those are like the Scooper and the Demora Eurorack effect things. So the Scooper was basically like a standalone box that you can do the scatter effect on anything, which either sounds like your dream or your worst nightmare. So with the autofill-in, that's where the scatter is basically held. And then you can also use user programmable drum fill. So if I had, say if we were listening to this pattern, I can hit manual trig to cue in and auto fill in, and it quantizes it to kind of shut off at the end of the phrase. So that makes it, again, a little bit more non-repetitive. You can listen to the same pattern over and over, and if you have a drum fill that comes in every 8 measures, 16 measures, 32 measures, it's going to sound really groovy and pretty awesome. And you can customize that. So really, in addition to the 8 measures that you get for your pattern, you have 2 extra things that you can add on top of that, which is great. You are welcome, people. Anyway, so yes, sir.
Sidechaining, does it still function similar to the TR-8, or is it internalized?
Yes, and that is going to kind of get tied into the next section. So I'm going to get into sidechaining, and I'm also going to get into what is this thing? Why is it plugged into the back of the TRS or TR-8S? Just real quick things before we take like 5-minute break, 10-minute break. SD card for sample import. You want to load in all your samples on there. You can make your own file structure. You can kind of make, my kick drum folder, my snare drum folder, my samples folder, and you can import all of those audio files in their entirety just by importing a folder, which is really cool. And then it loads the sound files on the drum machine itself. So I can basically import everything and then unplug the SD card and still be able to use my stuff. I can even make backup files of like my whole custom drum kit with my own custom samples and give it to, say, those of you who also have a TR-8S that want to try out my sounds. And it's really easy to do that. You can even go so far as to export custom kits with your own custom sounds and send just that kit to your friend, and it brings those samples with it that are attached to it. So you don't need to import their entire library. You can import just their one kind of cool kit or pattern. So with that, we're going to take 10 minutes, and then we're going to get into getting into the modular stuff. So thank you. Stick around, pizza and hands-on stations and music. All right. Hello, and welcome back to the TR-8S System 500 kind of masterclass, I guess. That's pretty cool. So we left off pretty much getting a pretty general, nice overview of the TR-8S, what it could do, some of its upgrades from the previous model, some of its strengths, and we're going to get into how to expand that into other things, most notably Eurorack, this crazy Eurorack synthesizer that I have up here. Now, I saw people that have Eurorack. Who's like Eurorack curious? Like, it's kind of like into the idea. Okay, Euro curious. That's how it sounds really nice. And there's so many Eurorack curious folks out there. People that are intimidated by the cost, maybe, or by just the sheer complexity. And I hope that I demystify some of that for you tonight. So Roland has made their own Eurorack line. And for those of you who just like never heard of the word Eurorack is a format of synthesizers. Now check this out. It's a format of synthesizers where you can buy modules that do different things, dedicated functions that you can connect together to form your own custom synth. Now, is that the best thing that you've ever heard, your own custom synthesizer? I think so. It's essentially like a hot rod for synthesizers, because you can buy an oscillator from one company, filter from another company, sequencer from a different company, and mix it all together. You can take the things that interest you. Maybe you're into kick drums, maybe you're into pads, maybe you're into sampling, and you can make your own custom machine that does exactly what you want it to do. And I love it. I think it's so great. But it's also a gigantic time suck, because you find that yourself basically patching things from scratch that you would normally just be able to kind of pick up and play on a normal box. But we're insane, the people that like this. I don't know what's wrong with us, but we choose to do this thing. The which one? Oh, the Grandmother. I got a chance to play a little bit of the Grandmother at Moogfest, and it was nice. There's a lot of like entryway things that's like really popular. Pittsburgh Modular just came out with their microvolt that looked really interesting.
It's also the synth meme of the year. Synth meme on Facebook.
You'll the Grandmother.
Yeah.
The Grandmother, yeah. Anything, so that's like a kind of a cool trend of synthesizers that they come out with patching, or like semi-modular is like the buzzword that people use. And you have the synth, and then you have the patch, like you can kind of reroute the signal to do different things, which I think is really fun. And it's a nice gateway. We have a little bit of that. We have the SCO2, which has CV ports that you can use either inputs or outputs of. But even before that, we have the System 1M, which I just don't have for you today. I don't have that, but System 1M, do you have that? You have a buddy that has one. Yes, that's good. Good for your buddy. That thing is awesome. It has patch points. It's the closest thing to like a Mother 32, but you can actually like store presets, and it's an audio card. You can kind of sync it with your DAW. And it's really great. So for the more insane people that have actually invested into this thing, we have modules for you called the System 500 modules, and they're based off of a System 100M synthesizer. Who's heard of a 100M? Hey, a lot of people. That thing is awesome, right? It's super cool. And we've been kind of developing these modules that have a lot of that DNA and a lot of that sound ported into a modern format such as Eurorack. So it's kind of like a cool throwback thing, but it's a great way to get vintage Roland sound into your setup, which I think is really cool. So we came out with our initial run, I think like a year and a half ago. They sold out immediately, and then it took them forever to kind of make them again because of manufacturing stuff. And so now we've kind of come back with a vengeance, and we have a latest run of modules, which I'll get into. Most of which are based off of the 100M, and then one is based off of an SH5. Who's heard of an SH5? Fewer people. A little obscure, right? But some regard it as like one of the coolest mono synths, having one of the best filters, and we've ported that filter into Eurorack, which I'll get into a little bit. So the TR-8S has this mysterious jack called the trigger out. And you use an 1/8" connection to go from that into something that accepts timing or clock. You can use it to clock a sequencer. You can use it to trigger an envelope. You can use it to time any Eurorack or analog-oriented module that you might have, whether it's like an older system or a Eurorack system. I think it's like 15 volts. It's like some outrageous number, and it will basically clock anything that you throw it to. So in this case, I can use the TR-8S's trigger out to control the sequencer that I have, which is controlling the System 500 stuff. So it just to kind of get a sound of like what it is that sounds like. That is all analog. That sounds ridiculous. Awesome. Cool. We're in business. So how does that actually work? So the way that it does this, I'll try to break it down as kind of as basic as I can. So the crash symbol and the ride symbol on the TR-8S, you can see on the silk screen it says trigger out if you hit both of them at the same time. So those of you who are familiar with clocking things to old drum machines are familiar with using like a rim shot or some other drum to control the timing of an analog system. And it was cool that you could do that, but you had to sacrifice the use of an entire drum sound. So with the TR-8S, you could technically do that with the individual outs, and you can configure them to be triggers. They give you your own individual trigger output to do this with. So when I hit the trigger out kind of command, it brings me basically to a sequence that has basically nothing on it. So I'm gonna. Oh my God. Okay. So I'll go to the trigger out track right here, which is its own individual thing, and I can start to lay down little trigger hits that will send a signal to my sequencer telling it to go to the next step. I can clock it, I can time it, it's reflected in the speed of my drum track, and if I start to kind of maybe do quarter notes, it basically plays in that rhythm that I created right there. And this is really cool because I can have, on one hand, I can have a sequence that just sounds like this. That's all it's doing. But when I start to externally clock it, I get a lot more variations. I can take that melody and stretch it out. I can take that melody and start to jump through it in different rhythms. And use the TR-8S as a controller for the sequencer. And I'm getting like cool polyrhythmic, stretching over the bar line, variations of this melody that sounded a little dull before if it's just like repeating at the same thing over and over and over again. You guys with me so far? Does that make sense? Okay, cool. It's a little bit weird when you've never used a trigger before, especially when I'm like, hey, look at this complicated thing. But this is kind of like where I get the enjoyment out of like hooking two pieces of gear together. And you don't need a gigantic Eurorack system to kind of have this interaction. You can actually use our SH01A, the thing that we're going to give away, has a clock in, has a trigger in. So you could have a sequence on that just is like something that's like really boring and whatever. But when you start to incorporate this kind of like interplay between two analog systems, this is where it gets like really fun. And this is where I think a lot of classic kind of more electro, or even kind of going before that, and like the synth rock type of stuff from the 70s and 80s got a lot of their ideas, was like just messing around and coming up with something cool. And even I could take advantage of, say, the substep. And it skips through, it speeds up the triggers and it speeds through the sequencer in different ways. And that's like really cool because I'm basically, this is like acting as a conductor for my modular. And then when I start to kind of work in different types of drums, it's all syncing, right? Because it's following the same tempo. I can slow it down. And the trigger track is slowing down with that. It's completely time dependent on the TR-8S because, as I said before, the TR-8S is kind of acting as a conductor for everything. So this is like one of my most favorite things to do, and it's also really fun to do when you're doing it live, improvising. You can basically bring a drum machine, you can bring like a mono synth that has that capability, and you can have maybe like 16 sequences that you like saved in it. And then when you have this interaction, you can take just one sequence and stretch it out into many different variations. So, questions so far on that type of concept? Great. Okay, cool. So, trigger out going into the Eurorack system. Let's go talk a little bit about our Eurorack world that Roland has. So, based off of 100M modules, we have a couple different things to choose from in terms of what we're doing here. We came out first with the VCO 512, which has 2 oscillators built into it, which I think that's what you're hearing now. Those are the square waves, which sound super hairy and awesome. And it's a dual VCO, so it basically has 2 copies of an oscillator on either side, which you can use to do like really cool detuned kind of effects. I can also go into, say, like, that's like the sawtooth wave, triangle wave, things like that. I can kind of go to the outputs and start to mix and match the waveforms, doing different types of things. And it's all analog, so it sounds really fat, really warm. There's a little bit of that drift and kind of like the things that people like analog for. This kind of embodies that. There's also really nifty types of modulations on the bottom that I can use to do like pitch automation or pitch control, FM, things like that. I can kind of abuse it if I want to, and it packs a lot of punch. Now, if I kind of go sequentially, I have the 512 VCF, which is also based off the System 100M filter, which also sounds pretty cool. I think in this patch too, it's acting as like a kick drum type of thing. You can make it self-resonate by hiking up the resonance all the way, and it kind of forms its own kick drum. If you kind of use an envelope to it, it sounds really kind of dirty and like very punchy, almost like a 909. And it just has a really kind of silky character to it. The filter that we're hearing now is actually our newest filter called a 505, the System 500 module 505. And this is really interesting because it has essentially 2 filters built into one. Those of you who are familiar with the SH5, the filter has a multi-mode on one hand, which could be low pass, or band pass, or high pass. It sounds razor sharp. And the resonance also sounds really cool. So those of you who've had like Moogs, ladder filters, things like that, you hike the resonance and it takes away all the low end. You have to compensate by like turning up the signal really loud, and you know, it's that type of design has been kind of beaten to death in my opinion. So this type of filter design, it doesn't self-oscillate, but it gets this really cool kind of like rounded edge that does not take away from the low end at all. So I'll hike it up all the way, and there's still plenty of low end that kind of carries the bottom. It sounds awesome. You can do some really cool kind of acid style stuff with it. So you're hearing one filter. If I wanted to bring in the other filter, there you go. The other filter is a fixed bandpass filter. I think it's like 6 dB bandpass, maybe. And that's all it does, but it sounds completely different than the bandpass that's on the other side. It has a really kind of like cool characteristic. So I can mix and blend the two together. I have the band pass on one side and I have the low pass on the other. And I get these like cool timbral combinations. I can kind of combine these two that are basically working in serial and kind of get all these like really interesting types of tones with it, much more so than I could with just like regular low pass filters. So I think that's really cool. There's also ways to kind of like change where the input is going out of the output, and it's overall like a really interesting kind of filter design. And there's a VCA built into it as well, so you can control the volume going out of it, which is super rad. So that's our 505. So those are our two filters. One's like really kind of silky, smooth, very traditional type of filter, and one is a lot more unique and interesting, I think. So kind of going down the line, we also have this 555 utility module, which has all of your bread and butter synthesizer types of stuff. It has portamento, sample and hold, noise, ring mod. I'm actually getting a lot of the tone right now through ring mod. I'm ring modding like two waveforms together to get like a very interesting timbres that way. And anybody that's ever used any kind of traditional synthesizer will see a lot of these functions. And sometimes you just need one module that just does it all. And this basically has all of like the things that you're going to rely on to get really different, simple style of effects. So you have that. You also have the sample and hold that has its own built-in lag time, so you can kind of smooth those changes over. So if I wanted to say, instead of using a envelope to control that filter cutoff, I could take this guy and go into here. And start to do kind of sample and hold style stuff. And using pink, white noise, sine effects, I can get kind of that sample and hold kind of randomized, jumping around type of effect, or incorporate that into other types of stuff. So it's got a lot of functionality built into one type of module, and it's really useful for any kind of context. There's that. There's the phaser module, which is also based off the 100M, that has a phaser, a delay, which is more like a circuit, and a gate delay. We have our VCA, which has 6 inputs total, which is ridiculous for any VCA. And there's 2 of them as well. They're basically mirror images of each other. You have 3 attenuated modulation inputs that you can use to for envelopes or LFOs or different types of control signals going into it, and it's just super useful. That, I think, was probably like the cheapest mixer type of module that you could get before we actually came out with a proper mixer, which I'm using to blend everything together. So if we look down, there's the 531 6-channel mixer that has 6 inputs, performance mute buttons that I can kind of bring in and out, and they're like relatively clickless. I wouldn't say that they're like completely void of any kind of like cut, but it has a very rounded edge, and it sounds good when you do it. There's also CD over panning as well, so I can control pan of different types of channels with different types of like LFOs, envelopes, things like that. Multiple output formats like 1/8 inch, 1/4 inch. It's all stereo. Sounds great. And here's where it gets really weird. There's a preamp built into the mixer as well that is a stereo 1/4 inch. So if I had like a stereo boutique or something and I wanted to get a stereo feed, I just connect it to the preamp. It's normal to channels 5 and 6, and it has a gain stage, so I can actually overdrive it. This thing is really cool. Like it has like just enough unique features that like makes it really useful. And it's also $399, I think. Maybe Daniel can confirm that, but I think it's like $399, which I think is really interesting because a lot of mixers in the Eurorack world are like $700, $500. And it's like, why? Why does it need to be like that? And then there's also a 1/4 inch headphone output, so that's super rad. So there's that. And then, oh my God, there's like so much. So there's that, and then there's also kind of basically taking the entire legacy of our first Eurorack line. Our 510 module has oscillator, filter, and VCA of the previous modules that I had built into one module. So if you don't want to buy, like if you don't care about dual modules or anything like that, and you just want like a Roland, like all Roland type of sound in your rack, the 510, this guy right here, basically gives you all that crammed into one thing. And it gives you, everything is normal to be cableless, so you don't need cables to actually get noise out of it. And you can also kind of incorporate different signals using the mixers right here. And it gives you both line and Eurorack level output. So my Eurorack friends know that the Eurorack level is ridiculously hot. So it gives you that, and it also gives you line level to route into mixers or some other kind of line level synthesizer signal. So it definitely gives you a lot in there. So story time to kind of like wrap around the Eurorack conversation of Roland. Roland got into Eurorack and all of our stuff sold out immediately. It's because it was being manufactured in Portland, because these modules are a design collaboration with Moleco. Who's heard of Moleco? Wow, a lot of Moleco people. Awesome. I thought you had a Moleco shirt on right now, but it was Sonic Youth, so that's cool. That's cool too. Anyway. So Josh from Moleco, super awesome, actually kind of like developed this idea with a couple Roland engineers. They wanted to do a Eurorack project, and this is kind of like the product of that. So initially, they were all made in Portland, and the demand was so high that they immediately sold out. And he was like completely swamped because he also manufactures for many other companies, Harvestman, his own company, other different types of brands. And they finally were like, okay, you know, this is still your designs, but let us manufacture it in Japan where we can just like crank these things out like crazy. And that's what they did. They spent a while kind of porting that process over to Japan. And the result is now you can get these modules. They're in supply. You don't need to worry about stock. They're not pre-ordered or back-ordered or anything. And what's really cool is that there's like these weird, kind of like a mythos about it. There's like a minor differences between the modules aesthetically. Like, for example, these big red buttons. Wait, do you see these red buttons? Let me see. Those red buttons, you see them? Those red buttons. These are not what the original Moleco made modules only had like a little kind of like red stick. The Japanese put like red buttons on it, which I think is like super cool and kind of fun because it makes you just like want to push it all the time, which is great. Also, from my own personal perspective, I imagine that I think the Japanese envelopes to me sound a little bit faster and snappier somehow. I don't know why, but that's pretty much the only difference that I sense between the modules. So a little bit of Roland history background, kind of insider scoop. And yeah, that's our Eurorack line. So if we want to just like listen to it a little bit one more time. That's with the sample and hold going into it. So if I wanted to maybe change it back to what we had before. Which So when you use things like this together, I think you get a really much more fuller and more engaging type of performance happening. You have the trigger out, triggering everything. You have like the great Roland sound that kind of provides this really cool template to get super electro if you wanted. And then everything is synced together, obviously. Oh, and final thought for my friend who brought up the sidechain question to me in private I almost forgot. So on the TR-8S, this is like my last thing to kind of tie everything together. On the TR-8S, they've kept the sidechain effect. Are we all familiar with sidechain and what that sounds like? It's like a way to pump amplitude with a key signal. In the TR-8, you had your own dedicated sidechain track that didn't make any noise. It just told you where to sidechain, which was like kind of cool. Now they've tied it to different instruments that you can sidechain together. So in this case, we're gonna hear it go into the, it's tied to the bass drum. So right now you can't hear the bass drum, but when I unmute it, it'll start to go. And I can go into the kit settings and adjust the depth, make it like super obnoxious. You know, people like that. Let's do the tempo. Super electro, right? Like that sounds super fun. So there's that. You can also tie in different types of effects. You can control the panning of the external input. You can use the reverb internal to the TR-8S. Makes me think I'm like Clark or somebody. Like that's just super fun. Like that's a very Clarky thing. So if you want to get the Clark effect, now you know how to do it. But so there's that reverb sends, delay sends. I mean, it just gets a lot of fun when the TR-8S already does so much. But when you start to kind of bring in that extra sauce, that extra element, doesn't have to be your Eurorack. This is obviously a super expensive solution to that problem, but a really good one. But you can use literally anything with the external input. You can use whatever synth that you have lying around. You can hook up your microphone if you wanted to, if you had the right cord. There's really a lot that you can do with it. And I think that Roland did a super fantastic job with the TR-8S, kind of taking all that great input and feedback that we got from customers like you guys and artists and people that just like wanted a really great product from us, told through our own lens. And I think we did a really good job. So I think that's it for me if we want to get to the raffles. But I appreciate you guys coming out tonight to hang out with me. And we're going to be around until at least like 9, maybe a little bit after, to do hands-on stuff. Come ask me questions. Come bother me. Come bother Daniel. And let's give away some free stuff. So, yeah.
All right, everybody, give Peter another big round of applause and Roland for doing all this.